"Remove this broke woman from our table," my daughter-in-law told security in the middle of our family dinner, loud enough for every guest in the restaurant to hear. My son lowered his eyes and said nothing. I simply folded my napkin, stood up slowly, and smiled at the waiter who looked too uncomfortable to meet my gaze. What none of them knew was that the restaurant they were so desperate to impress their investors with had been standing on my property for nearly 30 years. I'm Evelyn Whitmore, and at 68 years old, I thought humiliation was something people eventually outgrew. I was wrong. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River, all glass walls and gold lighting, the kind of place where every cocktail had rosemary sticking out of it, and nobody looked at the prices on the menu. Nathan had invited me there himself 3 days earlier. "Just family," he'd said over the phone. "We miss you, Mom." I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone against my ear while soup simmered on the stove. Those words had warmed me more than they should have. Because when your own child starts speaking to you less and less after marriage, even small kindnesses begin to feel precious. I spent nearly 2 hours getting ready that evening. I chose a navy blue dress Frank used to love before he passed away 5 years ago. Nothing flashy, just elegant. I curled my silver hair carefully and wore the pearl earrings my husband gave me on our 40th anniversary. Looking at myself in the mirror, I almost recognized the woman I used to be before grief and loneliness quietly settled into the corners of my life. The taxi dropped me off in front of the restaurant just after 7. Snow drifted softly along the sidewalks while couples hurried inside wearing dark wool coats and expensive shoes. A young hostess greeted me with a polite smile until I gave her my last name. The smile changed after that. It tightened, became rehearsed. "Right this way," she said carefully, leading me toward the private dining section in the back. I noticed the table immediately. 12 people, crystal glasses, investors, lawyers, Nathan's new business partners. Sabrina sat at the center wearing a white designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment back when Frank and I first bought our family home. She saw me approaching and her expression froze for half a second before she forced a smile. "Evelyn," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "You actually came." I pretended not to notice the comment. Nathan hugged me quickly, distracted already by a man beside him discussing contracts. No one offered me a seat until Olivia quietly slid her chair over and whispered, "Grandma, sit next to me." Sweet Olivia, the only person at that table whose kindness still felt genuine. Dinner moved awkwardly from the beginning. Sabrina dominated every conversation, laughing too loudly, touching Nathan's arm constantly, making little comments about luxury vacations and country clubs. Every time someone asked me a question, she answered for me before I could speak. "Evelyn keeps things simple these days," she joked at one point while sipping white wine. "She's not really into business conversations." I smiled faintly and looked down at my plate. Years ago, I would have defended myself. But age teaches you something important. People reveal themselves best when you stop interrupting them. Then came the moment I realized this dinner had never been about reconciliation at all. One of Nathan's investors asked how long the restaurant had been in the family. Before Nathan could answer, Sabrina laughed softly and said, "Well, technically, Evelyn has been clinging to family assets for years." A few people chuckled politely, unsure whether she was joking. My chest tightened, but I stayed silent. Then Sabrina looked directly at me, her smile turning sharp enough to cut glass. "Honestly," she sighed dramatically, "some people just don't know when to let go." I reached for my water glass carefully. Across the table, Olivia looked horrified. Nathan stared at the tablecloth like he suddenly found it fascinating. And then Sabrina waved toward the security guard standing near the entrance. "Excuse me," she called sweetly. "Could you remove this broke woman from our table? She's making our guests uncomfortable." The entire room went silent. For a moment, nobody moved. The clinking of silverware stopped. Even the piano music drifting through the restaurant suddenly felt too loud against the silence hanging over that table. The security guard hesitated near the entrance, clearly unsure whether he had heard her correctly. Sabrina smiled at him impatiently and repeated herself in a softer voice that somehow sounded even crueler. "Please remove her. This is a private dinner." I looked at Nathan then, not at Sabrina, not at the guests staring down into their wine glasses pretending not to listen. My son sat frozen beside his untouched steak, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed somewhere near the candle in front of him. He looked exactly like his father whenever guilt started eating at him from the inside. But guilt and courage are not the same thing. Nathan said nothing. That silence hurt more than Sabrina ever could. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and stood slowly, smoothing the front of my dress with steady hands. The young security guard approached carefully, almost apologetically. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I am sorry." His kindness nearly broke my composure more than the humiliation itself. I smiled gently at him. "It is all right," I said. "You are only doing your job." Olivia pushed her chair back suddenly. "Grandma did nothing wrong," she blurted out, her cheeks flushed with anger. Sabrina immediately turned cold. "Olivia, sit down." "No," Olivia whispered. "This is disgusting." Nathan finally lifted his head. "Enough," he muttered, though his voice carried no authority. Olivia looked at her father with tears gathering in her eyes, stunned that he was allowing this to happen. I reached over and squeezed her hand softly before she could say anything else. "Stay seated, sweetheart," I told her calmly. "Do not ruin your evening for me." The words tasted bitter the moment I said them because we both knew the evening had already been ruined long before security ever walked over. I picked up my coat from the back of my chair while Sabrina took a slow sip of wine as if nothing unusual had happened. One of Nathan's investors cleared his throat awkwardly and tried to restart the conversation about commercial real estate. But nobody truly recovered after that moment. Shame has a way of lingering in the air like smoke. As I walked through the restaurant, I could feel eyes following me from every table. Some looked uncomfortable, some curious, a few looked sympathetic. But sympathy is a lonely thing when it comes from strangers instead of family. The cold Chicago wind hit my face the second I stepped outside. Snow had started falling harder now, covering the sidewalks in a thin white layer that sparkled under the streetlights. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and stood there for a moment watching my breath rise into the night air. My hands trembled slightly, though not from the cold. Across the glass windows of the restaurant, I could still see the private dining room glowing gold in the distance. Nathan laughed weakly at something someone said, trying desperately to pull himself back into the evening Sabrina had built for him. That hurt too. Not because he laughed, but because he had become the kind of man who could humiliate his own mother and still continue eating dinner afterward. A black sedan pulled up near the curb then. I recognized the driver immediately. Marcus Reed stepped out from the front seat and hurried toward me, without his security jacket now, only a dark wool coat dusted with snow. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, lowering his voice. "I did not realize it was you." I studied him for a second before recognition settled in. "You worked for Frank years ago," I said softly. Marcus nodded once. "Your husband helped me when my father got sick." I never forgot that. For the first time that evening, I felt something warmer than humiliation move through my chest. Not comfort exactly, just the quiet reminder that kindness leaves fingerprints long after people are gone. Marcus glanced back toward the restaurant windows carefully before speaking again. "They really do not know, do they?" he asked. I looked toward the glowing building beside the river, then back at him with the faintest smile. "No," I said calmly. "They do not." Marcus opened the back door of the sedan for me, but I did not get in right away. I stood there beside the river watching snow collect along the edges of the sidewalk while traffic moved slowly through downtown Chicago. The city looked beautiful at night. Cold, expensive, distant. Frank used to love nights like this. He would drive us along Lakeshore Drive every December just to look at the skyline glowing over the water. "This city respects people who build things," he once told me during one of those drives. At the time, I believed he meant buildings and businesses. Now I understood he meant character. Marcus waited quietly beside the car, patient enough not to rush me. Good men often understand silence better than words. Finally, I slid into the back seat and closed the door gently behind me. The warmth inside the car fogged the windows almost instantly. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, but did not start the engine yet. "Would you like me to take you home, Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked carefully. I stared out at the restaurant across the street. "Not yet," I said softly. "Drive me around for a little while." He nodded once and pulled away from the curb without another question. Chicago drifted past us in gold reflections and wet pavement. Holiday lights wrapped around bare trees outside luxury hotels, while bundled couples hurried beneath umbrellas carrying shopping bags from designer stores. Years ago, Nathan loved this city the way Frank did. He used to beg us to bring him downtown during Christmas season just to see the giant tree near Millennium Park. Back then, he held my hand when crossing streets. Back then, embarrassment was something he felt after spilling hot chocolate on his coat, not something he inflicted on his own mother in front of strangers. I leaned my head lightly against the window and closed my eyes for a moment. The exhaustion settled deeper once the adrenaline faded. Humiliation is strange that way. It keeps you standing while it happens, then quietly crushes you afterward when nobody is watching. You knew Mr. Whitmore very well? Marcus asked after several minutes. I smiled faintly without opening my eyes. Since we were teenagers, I replied. Frank believed every problem could be solved with patience and paperwork. Marcus laughed softly under his breath. That sounds about right. The car stopped briefly at a red light near the Riverwalk. Marcus hesitated before speaking again. I should probably tell you something, he said carefully. After you left, the room completely fell apart. I opened my eyes slowly. Oh, one of the investors walked out almost immediately. Then another. People were uncomfortable. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror. Your granddaughter defended you. A warmth touched my chest at that. Sweet Olivia. And Nathan? I asked quietly. Marcus exhaled through his nose. He looked like a man realizing too late that he had lost control of something important. Outside the car window, snow continued falling in slow, quiet waves over the city. I thought about Nathan sitting at that table beside Sabrina, trapped somewhere between shame and weakness. Frank always worried our son wanted approval too badly. People like Nathan mistake admiration for love. He told me once after Nathan graduated law school. That makes them easy to manipulate. At the time, I defended my son fiercely. Mothers always do, even when they should not. Marcus turned onto a quieter street lined with old brick buildings and antique storefronts. Then he finally asked the question I knew had been waiting between us all evening. Are you going to tell them? He said. I looked down at my wedding ring, still resting on my finger after all these years. Frank once joked that I would probably be buried wearing it. Not tonight, I answered calmly. Tonight they still believe they embarrassed a helpless old woman. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he already understood the danger in that assumption. I watched snow gather along the corners of the windshield and allowed myself the smallest smile of the evening. Because for the first time in years, I no longer felt invisible. I felt awake. Marcus finally drove me home just before midnight. My house sat quietly beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, the porch light glowing softly against the dark. Frank always insisted on leaving that light on whenever I went out at night. A home should always look like someone is waiting for you, he used to say. Even after 5 years without him, I still left it on. Out of habit. Some kinds of love settle into walls and never really leave. I thanked Marcus before stepping out of the car. He handed me a small white business card before I closed the door. In case you need anything, he said. I slipped it into my purse without looking at it closely. Thank you for tonight, I told him sincerely. Marcus gave a small nod. Your husband once told me loyalty matters most when it becomes inconvenient. His expression darkened slightly. I think he would want you to remember that now. I stood there for a moment after he drove away, listening to the distant sound of traffic somewhere beyond the neighborhood. The cold air burned lightly in my lungs as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Silence greeted me immediately. Warm, familiar, lonely. I hung my coat carefully beside Frank's old wool jacket that still remained untouched near the hallway closet. Sometimes I told myself I kept it there because I was not ready to donate it. The truth was simpler than that. I liked seeing it when I came home. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. I walked slowly through the dark kitchen and paused near the dining room doorway. The table still held the small Christmas centerpiece I had arranged earlier that week, though now the candles had burned halfway down. I stared at them quietly and suddenly remembered another dinner almost 3 years ago. Nathan and Sabrina had come over shortly after announcing their engagement. Back then, I truly tried to love her. I remember cooking an enormous Sunday meal because Sabrina once mentioned she adored homemade pot roast. I spent nearly 6 hours in the kitchen that day preparing everything from scratch. Frank even opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. Sabrina arrived 40 minutes late wearing oversized sunglasses and speaking loudly into her phone while Nathan carried inexpensive shopping bags behind her. During dinner, she barely touched the food. I usually avoid heavy meals, she said while pushing carrots around her plate. My trainer would kill me. Frank looked embarrassed for me, though he tried not to show it. Later that evening, while Nathan helped me carry dishes into the kitchen, I quietly asked if Sabrina was nervous about the wedding planning. Nathan sighed immediately. Mom, can you please not make things difficult? Difficult. That word stayed with me for years afterward. Anytime I asked why holidays suddenly needed to rotate around Sabrina's family. Anytime I questioned why Nathan stopped visiting without invitation. Anytime I wondered why my own granddaughter started apologizing to me in whispers. Somehow concern always became interference. Love became inconvenience. Motherhood became something to tolerate politely from a distance. I walked upstairs slowly and changed into my night clothes before sitting down at the vanity in my bedroom. Snow tapped gently against the windows while the city outside settled deeper into silence. My reflection looked older tonight. Not weaker, just clearer somehow. There comes a moment in life when humiliation stops feeling sharp and starts feeling educational. You finally see people without the soft blur created by loyalty. I removed my pearl earrings carefully and placed them into the velvet jewelry box Frank bought me decades ago. Beneath the earrings sat another object I had not touched in years. A silver key attached to a leather tag. Riverfront Holdings Private Archive. My fingers rested on it for several long seconds. Frank gave me that key 6 months before he died. If Nathan ever forgets where all of this came from, he told me quietly one evening, promise me you will remind him. At the time, I laughed because I could not imagine our son becoming someone unrecognizable. Tonight, for the first time, I finally understood why Frank made me promise. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always did after difficult nights. The house felt unusually still, wrapped in that gray winter silence that comes just before snow starts falling again. I made coffee slowly and stood at the kitchen counter watching pale light spread across the backyard. For years, mornings had been the hardest part of widowhood for me. Even after 5 years, I still reached for a second coffee cup sometimes before remembering there was nobody left to pour it for. But this morning felt different. The sadness was still there, but something else sat beside it now. Clarity. I carried my coffee into Frank's old study and closed the door quietly behind me. The room smelled faintly of cedar and paper, exactly the same as it had when he was alive. His books remained arranged with impossible precision across the shelves, and his reading glasses still rested near the leather chair by the window. Some people would call that unhealthy. I call it loyalty. I sat down behind the desk and looked at the silver key again. Riverfront Holdings Private Archive. Frank handled most business matters himself while he was alive, not because I was incapable, but because we balanced each other that way. He built things publicly. I protected them quietly. That arrangement worked for nearly 40 years. Until now. I unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk and removed a thick black folder I had not opened since Frank's funeral. My hands moved carefully over the paperwork inside. Ownership documents. Trust agreements. Property records. The restaurant where Nathan humiliated me sat on land technically controlled through Whitmore Family Holdings, a private structure Frank established decades earlier after nearly losing everything during a lawsuit in the 1980s. Nathan knew the business existed, of course, but he never cared enough to understand how deeply it connected to the family. Sabrina cared even less. To her, wealth was something decorative, a lifestyle, a handbag. She never understood that real money usually sits quietly in locked drawers while louder people spend years pretending they own it. I was halfway through reviewing the files when my phone buzzed softly against the desk. Nathan. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. Good morning, Mom, he said carefully, his voice strained. He sounded exhausted. I glanced toward the snow gathering outside the study windows. Good morning, Nathan. Silence settled briefly between us. In the background, I could hear Sabrina speaking sharply to someone. About last night, Nathan finally began. Sabrina got carried away. I closed my eyes slowly. Not I am sorry. Not what happened was cruel. Just Sabrina got carried away. Amazing how weak men always describe deliberate humiliation like bad weather. I see, I replied calmly. Nathan exhaled heavily. The investors were important. Everybody was stressed. I almost smiled at that. Stress. Another convenient excuse people use when revealing their true character. You allowed security to remove your mother from dinner, I said quietly. Do not insult both of us by pretending that happened accidentally. Nathan went silent again. Somewhere in the background, Sabrina's voice rose louder. Who is he talking to? She snapped. Then more muffled arguing. I imagined her pacing through their expensive downtown condo with perfect makeup and growing irritation. For the first time in years, the thought no longer intimidated me. Nathan lowered his voice when he returned. Can we just move on from this? He asked tiredly. There it was. The sentence people use when they want forgiveness without accountability. I looked down at the ownership papers spread across Frank's desk. Of course, I said softly. Families should always understand exactly where they stand with each other. Nathan sounded relieved immediately. Thank you, Mom. I knew you would understand. After we hung up, I sat there quietly for nearly a minute staring at the phone in my hand. Then I opened the black folder again and pulled out a smaller sealed envelope hidden beneath the trust documents. Written across the front in Frank's careful handwriting were 7 simple words. In case Nathan ever forgets who built this. By noon, the snow had stopped and the city outside my windows looked polished and deceptively peaceful. I spent the morning reading every document inside Frank's old folder twice, not because I needed clarification, but because touching those papers felt strangely like hearing his voice again. Frank believed in preparation the way some people believe in religion. He trusted contracts more than promises and quiet observation more than emotional reactions. Looking back now, I realized he saw this coming long before I did. Around 1 o'clock, I drove downtown for the first time in months. Chicago traffic crawled slowly beneath a pale winter sky while Christmas decorations glittered along Michigan Avenue. I parked near an older office building made of dark stone and brass windows, the kind of building people barely notice anymore because it does not need attention to prove its value. Whitmore Family Holdings occupied the top floor. Frank purchased the property in 1994 after a recession nearly destroyed half the businesses on the block. I remember people calling him reckless at the time. 10 years later, those same people asked him for investment advice at charity dinners. The receptionist nearly dropped her coffee when I walked into the office lobby. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quickly, standing so fast her chair rolled backward. I did not know you were coming in today. I smiled politely. Neither did I. The office still looked exactly the same. Dark walnut walls, soft lighting, quiet carpets that swallowed footsteps. Frank hated trendy offices. If a company changes furniture every 3 years, it probably has bigger problems, he used to joke. Several employees glanced up from their desks as I walked past, their expressions shifting from surprise to nervous curiosity. Most of them had not seen me here since Frank's funeral. A few older employees nodded respectfully. One younger man immediately stood and straightened his tie when I passed him. Respect behaves differently around people who built things from nothing. Helen Crawford was waiting near the conference room when I arrived. She had been Frank's attorney for over 30 years and one of the few people outside our family who knew exactly how Whitmore Holdings operated. Her silver hair was cut shorter now than I remembered, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. Evelyn, she said softly, embracing me once. I wondered how long it would take. I laughed quietly under my breath. Was I truly that predictable? No, Helen replied calmly. But Sabrina was. We sat together inside Frank's old office overlooking the river. Dust floated lazily through the afternoon light while the city moved far below us. Helen opened a thin folder already prepared on the desk. That did not surprise me either. Frank surrounded himself with people who stayed 3 steps ahead of disaster. Nathan signed preliminary expansion agreements last month, Helen explained carefully. The investors from dinner are involved. I looked through the paperwork silently. The restaurant planned to expand into 3 additional locations using Whitmore properties as collateral. My properties. Nathan had signed everything assuming the trust remained under his operational authority after Frank died. Technically, it never had. Frank only allowed Nathan limited management access, while I retained final ownership control through the family trust structure. Nathan never bothered learning the details because he assumed inheritance worked like birthdays. You simply received things automatically. Helen folded her hands carefully across the desk. Frank instructed me very clearly years ago, she said. If Nathan ever allowed greed or arrogance to outweigh loyalty to family, you were to regain direct oversight immediately. I stared down at the skyline outside the windows for several long seconds. Somewhere down there, Sabrina was probably having lunch with friends, laughing over expensive cocktails while planning another event designed to impress strangers. She truly believed power belonged to whoever looked richest in public. That was her greatest mistake. What happens if I reclaim control? I asked quietly. Helen met my eyes directly. Every expansion project freezes instantly. Every investor receives notice. And Nathan will discover very quickly that appearances are not ownership. The room fell silent after that. Deep down, I knew this moment had stopped being about money a long time ago. This was about memory, about respect, about whether Frank spent 40 years building something meaningful only for his own son to hand it over emotionally to the loudest person in the room. I finally closed the folder gently and looked at Helen with complete calm. "Prepare everything," I said softly. "It is time Nathan learns exactly who has been keeping this family standing all these years." The phone started ringing at 8:15 the next morning. I had barely finished watering the plants in the kitchen when Nathan's name flashed across the screen again. This time, I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he said immediately, his voice tight with panic. "What did you do?" I walked slowly toward the window overlooking the backyard. Snow clung to the bare tree branches while a pair of cardinals hopped across the fence searching for seeds. Nature always seemed strangely calm compared to people. "Good morning to you too, Nathan," I replied softly. He ignored that completely. "Our accounts are frozen. The expansion contracts got suspended an hour ago. Investors are calling me nonstop." I could hear movement in the background. Drawers opening. Sabrina speaking sharply to someone nearby. The polished confidence she carried at dinner 2 nights earlier had clearly started cracking. "There must be some mistake," Nathan continued quickly. "Helen Crawford refuses to explain anything." I closed my eyes briefly at the sound of her name. Helen always was excellent at timing. "I doubt Helen makes mistakes," I said calmly. Silence. Then Nathan lowered his voice. "This is because of dinner, is it not?" I leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. "No, Nathan," I answered quietly. "This is because your father spent 40 years protecting this family from people who mistake appearance for substance." He exhaled sharply. "Mom, please do not do this right now. We have millions tied up in these projects." Millions. Interesting how quickly family conversations become financial once money starts disappearing. "You should have thought about family before allowing your wife to publicly remove your mother from a table like unwanted furniture," I replied. "Now you are thinking about consequences." Sabrina's voice suddenly cut through the background louder this time. "Put me on the phone." Nathan hesitated. Then her voice came directly into my ear, sharp and furious. "I knew this was you." I smiled faintly despite myself. "Good morning, Sabrina. You are humiliating Nathan over one misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. Another convenient word wealthy people use when accountability arrives dressed professionally. I walked toward the coffee machine slowly while she continued talking. "The investors think the company is unstable now," she snapped. "Do you realize how damaging this looks?" I poured myself fresh coffee before answering. "You seemed very comfortable with public embarrassment 2 nights ago." Sabrina went silent for half a second. Then came the colder tone she used whenever charm stopped working. "Nathan deserves this company." "Nathan inherited opportunity," I corrected softly. "That is not the same thing." She laughed bitterly under her breath. "You really want to destroy your own son over hurt feelings?" That sentence settled heavily in the silence between us, because people like Sabrina never understand the difference between revenge and boundaries. To her, dignity was just another emotional inconvenience. "No," I said quietly. "I am trying to remind my son who built the ground beneath his feet before he handed it emotionally to strangers." She scoffed loudly. "You are just angry because nobody needs you anymore." That one almost worked. Almost. Because beneath every cruel sentence, there is usually one tiny piece of truth designed to wound deeper than the rest. Widowhood had made me lonely. Aging had made me easier to overlook. And somewhere along the way, I had allowed myself to become grateful for scraps of attention from my own family. But grief teaches dangerous lessons eventually. One of them is this. The moment you stop begging for love, people lose the power to starve you with it. "Tell Nathan to read the original trust documents carefully," I said calmly. "Especially the section regarding operational authority after moral misconduct involving family leadership." The silence afterward felt enormous. "What does that even mean?" Sabrina asked slowly. I looked down at Frank's wedding ring resting beside my coffee cup on the counter. "It means your husband never owned as much as he believed he did." Then I hung up gently before either of them could answer. 10 minutes later, another call came through, this time from Olivia. Her voice sounded small and shaken. "Grandma," she whispered, "Dad is freaking out." I closed my eyes briefly. Poor Olivia. Children always suffer most when adults confuse arrogance with strength. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" I asked softly. "I think so." She hesitated. "Grandma, did Grandpa really leave everything under your control?" Outside the kitchen window, snow finally began falling again in slow, quiet waves across the yard. I watched it for a moment before answering. "Your grandfather believed respect should never become optional inside a family," I said quietly. "And he made sure of it." By late afternoon, the entire city seemed covered in tension as thick as the snow piling along the sidewalks. Helen called shortly after 3 o'clock to confirm the emergency board meeting had been scheduled for that evening inside the private dining hall at the restaurant. The same room where Sabrina had publicly humiliated me only 48 hours earlier. Life has an interesting sense of symmetry sometimes. I stood in my bedroom for several minutes deciding what to wear. Not because I wanted to impress anyone. Those days were long behind me. But because presentation matters when people finally realize they have misjudged you. I chose a black wool dress with a high collar and simple pearl earrings. Elegant. Quiet. Frank used to say true confidence never raises its voice. As I buttoned my coat, I caught my reflection in the mirror and almost smiled. For the first time in years, I no longer looked like a woman waiting to be included in her own family. I looked like someone remembering exactly who she was before loneliness taught her to shrink. Marcus arrived at 6 sharp in a black sedan. This time, when he stepped out to open the door for me, he wore a dark tailored suit instead of a security uniform. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully. "Helen asked me to personally escort you inside." The drive downtown felt strangely calm. Chicago glittered outside the windows in silver reflections and holiday lights, while snow drifted softly across the streets. Somewhere inside one of those office towers, Nathan was probably trying desperately to explain financial freezes to angry investors. Somewhere nearby, Sabrina was likely still convinced this entire situation could be solved with charm and outrage. Poor woman. She still thought power belonged to whoever spoke loudest. In the room, when we arrived at the restaurant, several black luxury vehicles already lined the entrance. Men in tailored overcoats stood outside speaking quietly into phones while valets rushed across the snow-covered sidewalk. The atmosphere felt completely different from 2 nights earlier. Less glamorous. More nervous. Marcus opened my door carefully and offered his arm. The hostess near the entrance immediately straightened when she saw me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quickly, nearly breathless. "Welcome back. Interesting how respect returns once paperwork becomes visible." Marcus guided me through the restaurant slowly while conversations lowered around us. Several employees I recognized from the other night suddenly avoided eye contact altogether. One waiter even stepped aside so quickly he nearly dropped a tray of champagne glasses. Fear changes people faster than morality ever does. The private dining room doors opened the moment we approached. Every conversation inside stopped immediately. Nathan stood near the far end of the table wearing the same gray suit from 2 nights earlier, though now it looked wrinkled and exhausted. Sabrina sat beside him stiff as marble, her expression carefully controlled but her eyes sharp with panic. Around them sat lawyers, investors, and board members flipping through thick folders of legal documents. Helen stood near the windows overlooking the river, calm as always. "Mrs. Whitmore," she announced evenly as I entered the room. "Not Mom. Not Evelyn. Mrs. Whitmore." The room rose almost instantly. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as investors stood to greet me with polite handshakes and nervous smiles. Nathan stared at them in stunned disbelief. For the first time, he was seeing the version of me his father always knew existed. The one hidden beneath years of family dinners and quiet sacrifices. Sabrina remained seated 2 seconds too long before finally standing as well. Even then, she could barely look at me directly. I removed my gloves slowly and placed them neatly on the table before taking the seat at the head of the room. My seat. The silence that followed felt enormous. Nathan swallowed hard. "Mom," he began. Quietly. Helen interrupted him immediately. "Operational authority has now officially reverted to Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore under Article 7 of the original family trust." Several investors exchanged uneasy glances while folders opened around the table. Sabrina looked toward Nathan sharply. What is she talking about? She whispered. Nathan looked pale now. Truly pale. I did not know, he admitted softly. That sentence echoed through the room heavier than shouting ever could. Because deep down, we all understood what it really meant. He never cared enough to ask. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after Nathan admitted the truth. The city lights reflected against the glass walls behind him, while snow drifted silently over the river outside, turning Chicago into a blur of silver and black. Around the table, investors shifted uncomfortably through paperwork that suddenly looked far more dangerous than profitable. Sabrina sat perfectly still beside my son, but I could see panic settling behind her eyes now. Not embarrassment, not guilt, panic. Because for the first time since joining this family, she realized she had miscalculated the person she thought was weakest in the room. Helen adjusted her glasses calmly before continuing. Due to violations involving family conduct and reputational liability, Mrs. Whitmore has chosen to suspend all expansion authority pending further review. One investor cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, surely there is room for discussion here. I looked toward him politely. Of course, I replied softly. I have no interest in destroying businesses, only in protecting what my husband spent his life building. Nathan finally stepped forward then, his face pale with exhaustion. Mom, he said quietly, I made mistakes. The words sounded rehearsed somehow, as though he had spent the last several hours trying different versions of accountability without fully understanding any of them. I studied him carefully. My little boy was still there somewhere beneath the expensive suit and damaged pride. But grief had taught me something painful over the years. Loving someone does not erase the consequences of who they become. You allowed your wife to humiliate me publicly, I said calmly. And worse than that, Nathan, you sat there hoping silence would protect you from choosing sides. His eyes dropped immediately. Across the table, Sabrina suddenly spoke up. This is unbelievable, she snapped. You are punishing us over one dinner. Helen closed a folder sharply beside me. No, she said evenly before I could answer. Mrs. Whitmore is responding to a documented pattern of misconduct. Sabrina laughed bitterly under her breath. Misconduct? I called security because she was making people uncomfortable. The room went completely silent again after that sentence. One of the older investors slowly removed his glasses and stared at Sabrina with open disbelief. Nathan looked physically ill now. For the first time, I think he finally heard his wife clearly without the protective filter of loyalty covering his ears. I folded my hands neatly on the table and looked directly at Sabrina. Do you know what the saddest part of all this is? I asked softly. She crossed her arms defensively, but said nothing. I would have given you both almost everything eventually. Nathan's head lifted sharply. What? I smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. Your father created the trust to protect this family, not control it forever. The restaurant, the buildings, the investments, they were always meant to support future generations. I glanced briefly toward Olivia sitting quietly near the end of the table beside Helen. But inheritance means nothing if character disappears first. Olivia lowered her eyes quickly, tears gathering there again. Sweet girl, at least one person in this family still understood that love and respect belong together. Nathan ran both hands through his hair slowly before speaking again. What happens now? He asked quietly. I looked around the room one final time. At the lawyers, the investors, the polished glasses of untouched wine still sitting on white tablecloths exactly where they had been 2 nights earlier when security escorted me out like a stranger. Funny how quickly power changes the atmosphere of a room. Now, I said calmly, the expansion projects. Pause indefinitely. Sabrina inhaled sharply beside him. Nathan will retain his salary and position under temporary review. Olivia's educational trust remains fully protected. Then I looked directly at my son. But operational authority returns to me until I decide whether this family still understands the meaning of loyalty. Nathan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of those words finally settling across his face. Not anger, not outrage. Shame. Real shame this time. I stood slowly from the table and slipped my gloves back onto my hands. Nobody moved. Nobody stopped me. As Marcus stepped forward to escort me out, Nathan's voice broke quietly behind me. Mom. I paused near the doorway, but did not turn around immediately. Dad would be disappointed in me, would he not? The question hung there heavily in the silence. I thought about Frank then, about Sunday drives through Chicago at Christmas, about coffee cups left beside newspapers, about 40 years spent building a life sturdy enough to survive even this kind of heartbreak. Finally, I looked back at my son one last time. Your father believed respect was the one thing money could never replace, I said softly. I hope someday you understand why. Then I walked out of the room slowly while the entire table remained standing behind me.